Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 64. With the recent announcement of some of the details of the upcoming PlayStation 5 and the idea of their new controller and the idea of the sort of tension feedback, I can't remember the exact term that they use for it, but sort of the adjustable tension of their triggers and buttons to give you a greater feel for the sort of games that you were playing and something programmable, it got me thinking certainly about the different ways that controllers and the way that we interact with games have give us all of that feedback.
I think that, we've talked about controllers, especially like gimmicky controllers on the podcast before, but I don't think we've really dived into how much, or I guess dove would be the proper tense, into like the specifics of controllers and how they give us feedback. I mean, there was a time where pressure sensitivity on the triggers or on certain buttons was revolutionary, because the old NES and SNES controllers didn't really have that. You either held the button or you didn't hold the button.
It was very 0-1, yeah.
And the fact that there are gradients of it now and that it sounds like the PS5 controller is trying to take that to the next step is really interesting. I mean, it's no secret to our listeners that I'm not a huge fan of gimmicky controllers. I mean, as we are recording this, Nintendo just released the Ring Fit game. I think came out last week, and like it seems more manageable than the Wii Balance board from back in the day. That it's a controller setup that is focused on fitness, but it sounds like the game they put out is RPG style and has more elements, and sounds like it's way more engaging and interactive than previous fitness stuff. But it still just feels like, hey, our controllers can sense movement. What can we do that would be really interesting that might get people to play differently? And the reality is some gamers don't want to play differently. Some people just want to control the games the way we've controlled them. But I think falling too far into that can be stagnating. I mean, if we stuck to those guns, we might not have ever ended up with dual analog sticks. The idea of aiming with a separate analog stick was so foreign until it happened.
Yeah, exactly. It's a matter of, it's good to have the strange outliers, the gimmicks, because some of them fall apart, and that's just the nature of innovation. And some of them, become part of our common language. And I feel there is a matter of, in terms of that sort of, I guess, gimmicky movement, a lot of it does come down to player feedback, which is where you run into a lot of issues with controller problems. When the Wii first came out, and it was sort of, I mean, there had been motion controllers before that. Even back to the NES era, there were motion controllers. The Power Glove was technically a motion controller, but how many of us actually used or even liked the Power Glove? But the Wii controller was one where everybody could move because it was the nature of the controller, or you could use regular buttons. But that being said, some of the launch titles showed the limitation of where the motion control was. Red Steel was a launch title for the Wii that was sort of a gun and sword game. And the very idea, I mean, when the Wiimote was first announced, the two things that got me super excited about it were, one, it was a controller that made its own light gun. And I have an unabashed love of classic light gun games.
Right.
So the notion of like, oh man, I don't even have to buy an accessory for this. I can do Area 51. I can do Point Blank. I can do Police Trainer. This is great. The other is it's a lightsaber. It is a goddamned lightsaber, and it's weighted like a lightsaber is supposed to be, because according to lore, the blade has no weight. So as opposed to all the dowels and wrapping paper tubes that we've used in the past, this is a lightsaber. There's a reason why Red Steel is not a well-remembered classic. We weren't there in terms of controls.
Right.
And we needed to take steps. But again, this level of feedback matters. I don't even know if the Switch at this point can give us lightsabers, but maybe we run into that a little bit with VR.
I mean, maybe. I mean, for sure, the wands for both versions of VR, the popular ones, the HTC Vive and the Oculus,
yes,
definitely seem to have very accurate one-to-one within the limited use of how VR is being used right now. You know, and I think that at the end of the day, I mean, remember, the Wiimote was only so accurate because in order for them to use it in Skyward Sword the way they wanted to, you needed the Wii Motion Plus, and for a bunch of games that came after it, which is an additional attachment added onto the Wiimote that gave it extra sensors.
And eventually they also released Wiimotes that had the Wii Motion Plus already installed.
Right. Because they continued to innovate as the system's life cycle progressed forward. It's funny, I shared a fortuitous photo on Fun and Games Facebook page as of when this drops about a week ago that shows PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo. And for PlayStation, it says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because most of the controllers are fairly the same since the first analog controller. Xbox, it says change is good because the controllers have gotten thinner and more refined and kind of more angular as it's gone on. And then for Nintendo, it just says parkour with a ton of exclamation points, because if you look at those controllers, like there's a gradual growth and then dip into the angularness of those controllers.
Oh yeah, they slowly added prongs.
Right.
Like the NES was a rectangle. The SNES had the little like kind of rounded dog bone edge to it. The N64 was 3 prongs. The GameCube, when you really get down to it, was 4 prongs, just 2 big, 2 small ones. And then it was like, then motion controls, then a screen. We're gonna put a screen on it.
Yeah. It and it's just very funny because looking at it in front of you, you know, I forget that most other game companies minorly tweak their controllers, but Nintendo has kind of been all over the map. And like, they don't even show the Sega Genesis stuff here as they're not making consoles anymore, but their controllers also were quite different from each other.
Yeah. Well, Sega was a company that in general was very, in its heyday, especially very experimental. There's a lot of stuff that nowadays we take as just part of the gaming landscape that Sega did 10, 15 years before it was viable. And the very notion of an online game service. We've talked about the Sega Channel in the past, and that's just one idea out of a very large and interesting pile.
Yeah, and going back to the minor changes to controllers, I mean, we might not have had analog sticks in the way that we did if not for the N64, because the N64 controller came out before PlayStation had an analog controller. They had just a D-pad controller, and it wasn't until after the N64's controller came out that they then worked on the twin-stick controller, the first dual analog. You know, and I forget where Xbox is in that life cycle too, but I think Xbox even came after that too.
Xbox is the PS2 GameCube era.
Right, okay, yes. So it's just interesting to see how the trends mirror each other, or, you know, and we talked about this on our motion control episode, but like the only reason the PlayStation Move and the Kinect exist is because of the Wii. If the Wii hadn't had motion control, these other companies wouldn't have tried to mimic it. Also, like, credit where credit's due for the Wiimote. While it wasn't my favorite controller, it's probably one of my least favorite controllers. For a lot of the game's uses, it was fairly precise, especially when you only required minimal movement for, like, say, Twilight Princess. You know, for that game to swing the sword in the Wii version, you didn't need big sweeping motions like the Skyward Sword wanted. It was very simple, precise movements. You know, and I think one of the big failings of both the Move and the Kinect is they were trying to do that but different and kind of plant their flag in the sand, and it's why the Kinect... Also, Nintendo didn't design games for the Wiimotes. They designed the Wiimotes and then said, all right, we have games. How can we incorporate this controller that the system is based around into the games? Whereas it feels like with Microsoft and Sony, it's like, here's a thing, here's a gimmick. Now make games just for that gimmick. And it's why those games, I think, suffered so much. You know, Zelda had motion control, but it wasn't because of motion control. It was still a Zelda game.
That is absolutely true, and I feel we've been talking about Skyward Sword. I need to do some due diligence for my family here. I know Skyward Sword gets a bad rap, and I have, to sort of continue the theme from last week, I've never played Skyward Sword, but I have seen all of it because my wife played it. And with no baggage about how people felt about it, she loved the fact that you had to swing the Wiimote around to use your sword the entire time. And friends would come watch her play because we'd be hanging out, and they're like, you can make very small motions. It's the Wii Motion Plus that'll pick up on it. She's like, yeah, I know. I'm swinging a sword, though. This is my sword. This is how I do it. And she had a really great time with it. Just being able to... Was she great at it? No. Did she beat it? Yes. And she had a great time doing it. And that is something that can't be overstated, certainly. But I needed to make that point. But also, I think you made a great point with the Kinect and the PlayStation Move, because it led design to go into a very weird sort of feet in too many pies, to mangle analogies. I like calling it that. But the Kinect had a couple of really good games and a couple of really fun. I don't even know if it necessarily had fun games. It had interesting experiences.
Right.
I've definitely played Disneyland Connect a bunch at a friend's apartment. And honestly, getting rid of, and this is going to sound like sacrilege to some people coming from me, but getting to make a dance game where you didn't need a dance pad is kind of a game changer. Like, if all that the Kinect and the Move gave us was just dance, you know what? I'd say there was some great success in that. And PlayStation did try something similar to all this in the previous generation. Not a lot of folks that I know of talk about the PS2 iToy.
Oh, that's
do you remember
true.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one that, you know what? If I find that for $5 somewhere, I'm getting it. There was a webcam dance game for that.
Yes, Scott the Waz actually did a great video on the iToy last month, and
nice, I'll have to check it out.
And how it's, it was mostly gimmick, and that some of them were fun, but as the whole, it was an interesting stepping stone of technology. And yeah, going back to what you're saying about Dancing Game, like Dance Central was an unequivocated success on the 360. It was one of the most popular dance games ever. It just didn't continue because Harmonix, changed a ton of stuff up. But it did birth the Just Dance series, which still continues. And like, what's great about the Just Dance series, especially on the Wii U and now the Switch, is that it's only tracking, especially on the Switch, it's only tracking one hand movement, because only one of the two remotes has like a sensor. And so as long as you're holding the remote and doing the moves, it grades you based on just movement, not as much as accuracy, which I think if you're going to make a dancing game, like, that's more important, right? DDR is a different thing. DDR is being an accurate gamer who also happens to be dancing, because it rewards you on exact hits for those steps.
Yeah, and as anybody who's seen nowadays, whether it is In the Groove or Dance Dance Revolution or any arcade or Dave & Buster's that still has a pump it up machine, it is never rewarding you for how you look while you dance.
Yeah.
And thus there's plenty of people. I remember in this past year seeing a champion level In the Groove player who's holding the back bar that's normally just for like momentary balance, and sort of having their feet positioned so they do as little movement as possible to push all of the appropriate buttons. It was a remarkable thing to see as far as just gaming achievement, but it is sort of the absolute other end of the spectrum of playing Dance Central on the Kinect in terms of where is the input being noted and what sort of feedback are we receiving. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that when control lends... I think control is at its best when it leaves room for inaccuracy. And what do I mean by that? So one of my biggest complaints about ukulele on the Switch is when I was controlling Yuka, because you're controlling, Yuka most of the time. Lele is just kind of along for the ride. It felt imprecise in the fact that, like, if my inputs weren't perfectly precise, I paid for it. I would miss a jump, I would get hit by an enemy, whatever. Right now I'm playing A Hat in Time on the Switch, which I was afraid of having something similar. But going back to what we were talking about last episode, the basic gaming loop of running around as Hat Kid, jumping, diving, doing double jumps, all felt super fluid. And I feel like if I missed a jump, it wasn't because my inputs were exact. It was more because I mistimed things. But I felt like the responsiveness was exactly how I wanted it to be. I moved and platformed exactly what I was looking for. The controls feel akin to Super Mario 64 as far as your movement in the space. And that feels more natural to me than the control for ukulele. Because if we go back and play Banjo-Kazooie, while it's a great game, it is not as super tight as probably the remake on the Xbox is, because the tech is just different. But also the development and how you develop those games can also affect that. And it's been really fun to play a platformer that also is more akin to Mario 64 because you get a timepiece and you exit the level for the most part, and then go back in to do the next mission a la Mario 64, which if it weren't for the painfully long loading times on the Switch version would be really cool. Because while I love Mario Odyssey and the control you have there to kind of just keep moving, it's nice to reset and do a different mission. It adds an episodic quality to a game. And the fact that the controls are tight enough that I feel like it's doing exactly what I want, but loose enough that if I screw up, I don't feel like it's an impossible platforming task, I think is really awesome and exciting about the current state of control that we have.
Yeah, I've even, I wish I could remember which games exactly, but I've definitely read interviews and sort of developer programmer confessions of the idea that when playing 2D games, there's a little bit of forgiveness programmed in based on where you jump from a ledge. Because, you play enough 2D platformers or games with 2D platforming and you develop a sense, this feedback kind of sense of how much of my sprite can be off the platform before I can jump, so I get more running time to build momentum. I'm closer to the other platform that I want to get to. And there are games that allow you to, for the briefest of frames, be entirely off the platform and still allow you to jump. You can Wile E. Coyote that business because that is sort of what is expected, and it continues that sort of, push button, get feedback, which is a very, I know it's discussed, but I still feel it is an under-discussed aspect of our playing relationship in terms of, as you were just saying with ukulele, you can feel when something is too loose or not giving you the right kind of feedback. There's no magic about it. Anybody who has trouble feeling that way, try using a mouse that is either way too or not enough not enough sensitivity for you.
Yeah.
Or be using a mouse that suddenly stops working. The feeling of you're moving the same exact object. It weighs the same, it moves the same, friction has not changed. And yet the feeling that your body gets, the kinesthetic shift is palpable. And we get that in our controllers as well. And certainly that was something we had to develop in the PS1, Sega Saturn, N64 era as far as joysticks go before we got context-sensitive buttons.
Yeah, and I think also part of that, the reason I mentioned Ukulele earlier is because their sequel game, Ukulele and the Impossible Lair, came out, and they completely shift perspectives. It's now a 2D platformer a la Donkey Kong Country, which also, this is the original team who worked on Banjo-Kazooie, the original team at Rare, so a lot of them also worked on the original Donkey Kong Countries.
Yeah.
That shift makes sense to me because based on the platforming mechanics that I recall from Ukulele in a 3D space, I feel like the lack of forgiveness or the challenge of platforming will be more direct because it's literally a dimension less in 2D. Yeah. I think it'll be tighter that way. And a lot of people have said the controls have been tighter. And it makes me excited to play a follow-up. Also, what a brilliant idea to change perspective in your follow-up. I mean, Donkey Kong did that the other way, doing the 3 Donkey Kong Country games, and then Donkey Kong 64 was in 3D space. Like,
most made that jump, yeah, from 2D to 3D rather than the other way around.
But I think it's exciting to think about, like, why can't games do that? And I think Control lends a lot of freedom to that. The fact that we can overly customize our control both on the development side and on the hardware side. The idea of, say, Shovel Knight going from a 2D platformer to a 3D platformer, or something that moved in more of a 3D space, like, that'd be really cool. And Shovel Knight Dig, which is coming out, I think, either later this year or next year, like, is playing with that a little bit. And so I think it's really exciting that because of how advanced our controls have become and how different the controllers are now, you can play with those kinds of different things. Whereas, like, in the Nintendo and Super Nintendo era, you couldn't really do that. I mean, we all remember how bad Sonic 3D Blast was. So, like, you know.
Oh, yeah.
I think that the freedom of control now allows us to experiment more in that space than we could ever before.
Yeah, it allows us to... It allows you to design a play style around the controller and vice versa, and it lets us go in all kinds of directions. And because we're now getting to the PS5 adaptive trigger, which is aspirational at the moment, we're currently in a spot where, they'd announced the new controller for the Nintendo Revolution, and I was getting excited about my light gun lightsaber. We'll see what happens when it comes out, but it's also, we find ourselves going in the other direction, and this is not a new thing either, which is touch controls.
Yeah.
And there is difficulty in getting feedback on that. Most of us carry around a smartphone these days, and that allows for a lot of different games. And some games really benefit from touch control. Some do not. And I'm putting my opinion down. Arcade style games and any kind of game that require reaction time, I hate having like a thumb touchscreen style gameplay. It's just no fun for me.
Yeah, I would agree.
If you have a little bit of time, puzzle games are great. Point and click games are it's the sort of thing of, again, Sega Channel was, 25 years ago, and now we've got this whole service. The heyday of the Sierra LucasArts point and click games was, 20 some odd years ago, but touchscreens make it great.
Yeah.
For me, they do.
Well, and also touchscreen control is a lie on most smartphones these days. Something I noticed I have the iPhone 8, so the one right before they get rid of the circle button. And I was so happy to have a circle button because, I don't know, I like having buttons. I'm one of those weirdos still. But
same.
It broke my brain when I turned the phone off and then just for the heck of it went to push the button, because who doesn't like pushing buttons? And I didn't feel anything. And it's when it dawned on me, the button isn't a button. It's a circle with haptic feedback that feels like a button. But the minute you power down the phone, it's just a circle divot in the touchscreen. And I was so angry at that. I'm like, so what you're telling me is I essentially just have a button app. I don't actually have a button.
But that haptic feedback is potent.
Oh my God, yeah. I thought it was an actual button for the longest time because it clicked in the way that Mac mouses and the other iPhones clicked. Even though it's not actually clicking, it's a haptic feedback that's tricking your brain into thinking it's clicking.
And because it is a singular button, you do not have to worry about relative position. So getting that minor feedback is all you need.
Yep.
In terms of thinking of early, pre-smartphone touchscreen controls, do you remember the Turbo Touch 360?
It sounds familiar.
The Turbo Touch 360 was a third-party controller for definitely the NES.
Oh yes, I do remember it. It had the the octagon pad that was like recessed and that you would like touch to do the D-pad stuff.
Yes, and it had that really goofy commercial with the two guys wearing controllers.
Yes, I do definitely remember that now.
If anybody who was alive during that time does not remember those commercials, look them up. Odds are you will have a sense memory come rushing back. But a friend of mine had a Turbo Touch 360, and after seeing all the commercials, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be so cool. It was terrible.
It was the worst controller. I actually think I had one at some point.
for that same reason as like, oh, you can move in any direction or in a circle. Well, if you have no idea where your like relative positioning is, you're screwed. You know, even though an analog joystick may not necessarily have a button to it, the fact that it has a central position that it can return to is invaluable. And in some cases, like Nintendo, GameCube, Wii era stuff, there was a recessed octagon that you could kind of settle the stick into to know that it's that direction. Any of those innovations, any of those aspects give something that has a more nebulous positioning a good responsive sense of relative position, which, you know, when you're playing Guitar Man on the PS2 and you can't look down at the controller, having all of those little moments, whether it is, and not just Guitar Man, but any game, because when you are doing high level or high tension play, you can't look at the buttons. You can't look at the controller. So you have to know intuitively what you're pushing, how it feels, and where it's going. So what started as an add-on Rumble pack for Star Fox 64 so that we could, you know, really feel it when we crash into stuff, now is a feature in controllers that can let us know when a zombie is approaching, or how a motion sensor that we're using is responding to us, or context-sensitive buttons pushing a little bit or hard based on how we're feeling can alter what happens on screen. And none of these developments can be taken for granted, because now they're packed into these controllers that we go, why is it $75 for a PS4 controller? Because there is multiple decades of development hours. Like, it's not just the last 10 years, it's the last 10 years done by dozens of companies, all layered on top of each other in a singular piece of technology. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up Rumble, because so I can't actually recall. So I've been using a new controller for a while on the Switch. And of course, we're going to talk about the Switch because it's what I always talk about.
Well, yeah,
it is our obsession. I got one of the 8-bit Do retro controllers, which it looks like a Super Famicom controller, but it has analog sticks and multiple shoulder buttons, so it can be used for any game, though I bought it for the use with the Super Nintendo games. I can't recall if it has HD Rumble or not, because I've been playing A Hat in Time, and I think it does, but like thinking...
I think it does, actually.
But thinking about it, like, I can't recall, because I'm just so used to things having HD Rumble that I assume it must, right? Like, otherwise, you know, but I don't get a sense memory for it as much as I used to, because I'm so used to it. It's been ubiquitous for as long as it's been, that I just almost kind of expect it to be there, whether it is or not.
Right. And I just checked. And the one that I have, I use the SF30 Pro. That one has Rumble in it.
Yep.
HD Rumble.
So mine must have HD Rumble, because I think that's the one I have as well. But again, it falls out of my head, because it's one of those things that I don't even know that I notice it anymore, because it's just kind of part of the experience.
Yeah, and you really have to go into a wildly different experience to get a new sense of that kind of feedback. Going back to VR for a moment, I haven't had a ton of experience with VR, but I have some friends in Brooklyn who, and I only say where they are because this is just to say that I don't get I don't get to go visit them as often, because I live in Upper Manhattan, they live in Brooklyn. Anyone who lives in New York City knows that even though we're in the same city, that is over an hour on a good day. But my friend Alex, he has set up for himself and his wife this amazing VR setup. It's an HTC Vive, and like he built the computer for it. They like rigged this up so that the headset like can hang from a beam on the ceiling, and you just kind of like take it off and pull it down, and there's all of the like, it is this amazing setup they have. These are also the people that before they got this, they would hold like entire days where we would be playing Just Dance on the Kinect, because the way their studio apartment is set up, it's brilliant for this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm saying all this to set up like that they have this big space, they have this cool whole kind of setup, and that is where I got to play Beat Saber for the first and dozenth time, and I love it so much. But the thing that really came through for me, because again, holding the two controls doing Beat Saber, that's great feedback. And again, it's that sort of lightsaber feeling. There's a little bit of a rumble. You get a feeling of when you're cutting through stuff. But there is an Aperture Labs, or an app called The Lab that's on Steam that is a series of mini games, essentially, but really good ones. It's kind of a Wii Sports for VR, but wrapped up in Valve's stylings. And one of the mini games in it, and this is what I'm getting to, is an archery mini game that's very simplified figures graphics by design, like it's all aesthetic. But it's one where you use the two controllers that you're holding. You pick up an arrow, you like bring the controllers together to sort of knock the arrow, and then you pull back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure exactly how much is HD Rumble, how much of it is the fact that you're immersed in the world with the headset on, how much is full imagination or whatever. But the feeling of tension that I receive in pulling back that arrow was palpable and immediate and intense. It was the kind of thing. Sarah had gotten to play with this one time before I did. And she's like, you need to play with all of this, and you need to play all the games that I played. And this was the first one because she had the same exact experience. And so Alex, Caitlin, Alex's wife, and Sarah all got to like giggle and watch me have the same, I don't know, religious experience that the three of them had. And it was just like, right, VR. Who knew?
Well, yeah, and it's totally all based on all of the feedback. So the first time I ever did VR, it was with the HTC Vive at a friend's house, and it was during a party he was having. And at one point, I was playing, I think, just accountant sim, or one of the sim games that has a little like computer screen friend, and he tells you what to do. I'm following the instructions and playing the game, and it feels weighty. And then someone's talking to me from the door of the room outside of the world of this game, and I can barely hear them through the headphones, and it completely disorients the experience. Like I feel like I'm falling through a wormhole because it's a disembodied voice, because the experience itself feels so real. And it's the precise controlling with the wands, whatever the controllers are called. I'm calling them wands for now.
Yeah, it's fine.
Like it feels tactical. Like I'm still on my stubborn path that VR is still a gimmick. And for the most part, I feel like it is. I just don't feel like it enhances a elongated gaming experience. But that said, the short spurts I've had with it have been phenomenal. And the games I've engaged with are really interesting and really unique. I think that as it becomes more compact, as it becomes more affordable and portable, the gaming experience will expand. Because at the end of the day, playing Skyrim on VR doesn't sound fun. It sounds fucking exhausting and terrifying. As someone who's a coward, going into a spoopy cave and fighting skeletons on a screen, manageable. Being in the same room with them, probably terrifying.
Playing Super Hot on VR is amazing.
Yeah.
It's a fun immersive experience on the PC, on console, but when you put the headset on, oh my God, it's fun.
Well, and that's an arcade experience, right? And I think those are the best experiences on VR because they're things that you can kind of do matchmaking or rounds of and then stop.
Agreed. I think that, and this is sort of what we've, the point that we formed and haven't like spoken yet, the idea that different playing experiences are they are suited to different play styles. I haven't talked much about the DDR pad. I mentioned, eschewing it for Dance Central and Let's Dance, but I mean, I own 2 DDR pads. I got my Red Octane foam pads, and during the heyday of, this is the two-pronged thing. One, to more on your point that you're making, the fact that it's great for playing a 2-minute song, a 3-minute song. Maybe you do Oni mode or one of the ones where it's like a marathon and it's like, oh, you really feel that. You don't want to play a platformer on a DDR pad unless, you're doing it for a charity stream or as a lark.
Right.
But even then, even in those arcade experiences, the dance pads at an arcade, there's a slight difference in where the buttons are relative to the metal of the rest of the platform. And the original cheap, like easy to store DDR pads that were coming out in the PS1 era, they were just like soft and flimsy. There was no structure to them. So in addition to them being able to like kind of scrunch up and bunch up like it was a slip and slide, there was no sense of am I hitting the buttons or not, except, oh, I'm failing on the screen. The Red Octane pads that I have, they have like a foam insert in them so that so they don't scrunch up, and the buttons are slightly raised so that you can kind of feel, you're not supposed to play with them with shoes on, as opposed to the arcades, but you can kind of feel that little difference. And that's also important because, again, you immerse yourself in the song for a couple of minutes, and you can't really look down at what you're doing, but you need that little bit of feedback, that little bit of something to have it, to enjoy it. But it's also not an experience that, I don't think I'd want to play Metal Gear Solid on my dance pad.
Sure. Well, and we talked about this when we talked about rhythm games, but like all of the controllers that were brought on by rhythm games was a specific moment in gaming history. We don't really have those anymore. For the most part, a lot of that stuff has gone the way of the dodo. It had some last gasps of breath with this generation's Rock Band and Guitar Hero Live, but they didn't really get very far. But like the idea that for a good solid decade, we were getting unique controllers for very specific experiences that, unless you continue to pursue those experiences, were otherwise useless. Like, think about, I think the most cliche and focused point of all of these controllers is the GameCube bongo controller for Donkey Konga and Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. It was a controller for 2 games. That's it. Just those 2 games. And I think it might have been useful with some Japanese games as well. Yeah. However, you can use it to control other games, and people have for charity streams. But the idea of that controller and people still wanting that controller is such a focused use, but it's still something that was made and innovated on. And like the drum sets for both Rock Band and Guitar Hero, the keyboard controller for Rock Band 3, like these are all controllers that were made to be used for very specific functions that you could in theory use to just control a game, because all of them had a D-pad and the regular face buttons on them just for navigating stuff.
Yeah, I always imagined using the Guitar Hero controller to do a 2D shoot 'em up. You could control up and down with the strum bar and then use your different weapons with that button.
Yeah.
The buttons on the neck. I think I've said that before, but that's just trying to find like strange new uses for specialized things. And with all of these different, whether it is haptic or non-haptic feedback on a touch screen that has no true buttons,
right.
VR, different HD rumbles and things of that nature, specialized controllers, you run into sort of an ebb and flow, because it can never be truly stagnant, of just design trends of immersion and sort of one-to-one analogs. You can make a Guitar Hero controller to give you a general sense of feeling like you're playing a guitar, but you're not. And Konami, with their Bamani series, of which Dance Dance Revolution is was one of the flagships, they made the Guitar Freaks game before Guitar Hero, which I think did something similar. Drum Mania, as well as Rock Band, was a little closer in creating a real world connection to it, but it still is abstraction. And the notions of making the connect or the move to kind of remove obfuscations and abstractions of, real-time movement having an effect on the game, which also, again, ebbs and flows. Nowadays, we still get some great rhythm titles. A recent one that came out that I'm excited to play eventually is Spin Rhythm XD, which is more in the style of Amplitude and Thumper and all these other games that they are rhythm games, and you are controlling along with the music, but you don't need you don't need a DJ pad. You don't need a keyboard to do it. you use the controllers that are already part of your experience, and they're designing with those in mind, and they make some fantastic experiences, even though you're not closer to not actually playing the keyboard.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of the innovation in the space of controllers comes from wanting to find new ways for gamers to engage, and even in ways that they may not be thinking of. And while, yes, I don't love the Joy-Cons independently, I feel like they work perfectly when you're using the Switch in handheld mode. And so it's a brilliant way to design controllers for something like that, and then also gamers like to think they know everything, right? We know what we want. We know everything about everything. But as we talked about 2 episodes ago, I had no idea I wanted to be an angry goose, a mischievous goose, if it were. But I didn't know it, but now I do know it, and I'm so glad I did. And had House not brought that gaming experience to me, I would have never asked for it. I would have never thought of it. And though, yes, that game is obviously based on existing gaming tropes, stealth games and other things, puzzle games.
Of course.
That goes without saying, but the fact of the way it was packaged, the way it was housed, as it were, I could have never predicted that I would have enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'm still talking about it. I'm still sharing memes about it, and I'm looking forward to playing it on my Extra Life stream as of when this airs this tomorrow. So, and I think with controllers, it's the same thing. It was very easy for me when I saw the Kinect or the PlayStation Move to go, I barely like the Wiimote. I don't want any of that shit. But when using it, it was a fun toy. It was a fun gimmick. But to the same degree, I had no idea I needed an analog stick. It was not a thing I thought of for controlling in a 3D space. But game developers, and more importantly, game hardware developers, did know that and anticipated it and created for it. We were always headed there. I mean, Doom and Wolfenstein didn't move into 3D space, but it sort of did, right? It was the illusion of 3D. And an analog controller makes the movement in that space better. And to be able to fortuitously see where that stuff is heading is something that I, as a gamer, don't even begin to imagine to know anything about. And I'm super grateful when it does work. Again, the 8-bit Do controller, which I've been in love with, it's so much smaller than I recalled a Super Nintendo controller being. But once I'm holding it, it's so comfortable and so easy to use that I'm so grateful to have it. And I love it for all kinds of games, not just Super Nintendo games.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's because, and we've talked before about the idea of, graphics get better and better, and how close can we get to reality in looks. But I think the bigger innovations in the greater sense of reality that we find in gaming is in those tactile interactions that we have with the controller.
Yeah.
So, Matt, what is your favorite, I guess I would say, tactile upgrade in your gaming experience? Whether that is within the same game, going from one kind of controller to another, or your enjoyment of one kind of game that in a later iteration you're like, oh no, I can't go back to the old way anymore.
What an interesting question.
Because I have one that I'm thinking of, and so I can answer the question to kind of give you an idea.
Well, I all right, yeah. Why don't you answer your own question and give me an out while I think, and then I will respond.
Of course, no, that's way easier. So, growing up, a game that my brother and I loved playing was X-Wing for the PC and Mac.
Mm-hmm.
A tour de force of a 3D space sim, dogfighting shooter game. 3D in 1993. My God. And you could control you needed to use the keyboard because that was how you adjusted so much of your cockpit systems and everything else. And you could use the arrow keys to move around in space, but you could only move so quickly and everything else. And you could also use the mouse to control it, but we never did because the mouse doesn't have a centralized point to come back to. So you could move in one direction and you would continue to spin in that direction. Chris and I had no idea why they even implemented a mouse as a control because there was no zeroing out. You would just keep spinning, and we did it a couple of times just through training missions so we could laugh our asses off about like wildly flailing around in our Y-wing. But then we finally got a joystick, like a flight sim joystick. It only had 2 buttons, one on the top and like a trigger. You know, it wasn't any of these fancy ones that could tilt every which way and whatever. But there was absolutely no going back in terms of how quickly we could maneuver, how well we could fly and play. And it even allowed for a very silly thing that my brother and I only did a few times, where this was pure player 2ism. He would be flying around with the joystick, and I'd be sitting in a chair near the computer chair holding the keyboard. And so I was basically the astromech for him. Like, all right, I switch to torpedoes. All right, cool. Shun power from lasers to engines. Okay, switch to, all of that stuff. He didn't have to push the buttons. He would make a command. He'd bark the command and I would do it. And it made for such a fun and weird experience. It was great. But that jump from keyboard and mouse to specialized joystick, we eventually got TIE Fighter, but I don't think I really used that joystick for many other games. But I've recently been on a nostalgia kick for those games, and that's why I've been thinking about it. And I'm like, I mean, now we've got the joysticks on the controllers. I would love to go back to those games. And that leap forward, I could never go back to just controlling it with a keyboard.
Yeah, it's interesting. So first of all, you may get your chance because within the last few months, Nintendo Switch re-released Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast on the Switch, which is a very popular PC game.
Yup.
So like the potential for other Star Wars PC games to come to the Switch is not unreasonable.
Oh yeah, and there's even been the Baldur's Gate, the Skybound games releases, and I've been hearing great stuff about their time on the Switch. So yeah, PC's coming to the Switch,
which is really interesting. But I guess for me, the biggest control growth that then I couldn't go backwards for would probably be for a style of game that I thought I was never very good at until I started playing more of them. But in the N64 era, though it was revolutionary for first-person shooters, I was not particularly good at them. I did okay. I loved GoldenEye like anybody else and Perfect Dark. But on the whole, they weren't well controlled. And then moving even to the Wii, they had some more gimmicky controls, but still felt imprecise.
Mm-hmm.
But the minute I played Borderlands 1 on an Xbox 360 with an Xbox 360 controller, like something clicked and I went, oh, that's how these games are meant to be played. That's why I never thought I was any good at these games. And now, of course, I'm still not great at aiming, but the dual analog is the way these games are meant to be played. And it just gives you such precise controls. Now, of course, the most precise aiming and controls will always be a keyboard and mouse. But the reason they're less precise for me is because I don't have those twitch reflexes. And what a controller gives me in a single-player shooter experience is the kind of preciseness I am comfortable with. And I like trying to go back and play GoldenEye on the N64 a few years back, like was rough.
Ooh,
like,
it's hard to go back to that game.
It's rough. Like Games Gone On, their series of episodes about Mario 64 talked about how it was rough to go back controlling Mario. But I'm inclined to disagree only because that game, you need precise platforming, but it doesn't have to be as precise as like a shooter is. And so for the limits that Mario 64 have, I don't feel like it was hard to play in any stretch of the imagination. But for sure, GoldenEye and Perfect Dark felt almost unplayable comparatively. And like what I'm really curious about, Doom, the new Doom 2016, the re-release of Doom that's gotten universal praise, has been on my Switch wish list for ages. Because while I could get it on PC, I'm sure it'll look nicer on the PC, I want a portable Doom experience that feels tight to control, because that hasn't existed. I know there have been Wolfenstein and Doom games, I think, released on the 3DS even at one point. I know for sure there was Doom 64, which is getting a re-release, which I'm excited about as well, because again, Doom 64 controlled well, but doesn't control as well as it does now in a dual analog system. And I'm really, really excited to play Doom 64 with dual analogs to see how much better it makes the control of that game.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where that goes too.
And so, yeah, for me, I think it's the evolution of dual analog is definitely the most impactful control function for me, especially because it most affected a style of game that I didn't play as much until after the innovation came along.
Yeah, the dual analog is definitely no going back now.
Yeah, for sure. And
I'm happy for it.
Well, yeah, like the one thing that Yooka-Laylee has over Banjo-Kazooie is the tight camera control. While the platforming controls had ups and downs for me, and other people might think I'm crazy, the camera control was perfectly fine because you don't have to hit buttons to shift the camera around. You have or slowly rotate it by holding a C button, which was the worst. You can easily spin the camera, and that's super useful.
Yeah, and we see the fruits of that development in so many different iterations, so many different franchises, so many different releases, and I love it.
Yes. But you, loyal listener, if you have a favorite control style, controller, game that is controlled a certain way, please let us know in the comments either on the site or on Facebook or anywhere you want to reply to us on the internet, because we love hearing your thoughts. Y'all have been super interactive, and we're always thankful for it.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for interacting with us. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I mean, we try to make it a point that for us talking about games in these episodes is about the subjective experience, because that's where your strongest feelings are. And honestly, this episode is very much about that. It's feedback. Thanks for yours, and thank you for being a part of the conversation. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.